I'm Raj, director of MHI. I have short, mostly black with some white at the temples now, hair, and I'm wearing a white shirt and a blue jacket. So I'm going to start off by addressing what I hear pretty often, which is I didn't realize there's a link between climate change and mental health. Now, both of these areas have seen a fair amount of attention in the last 4 to 5 years, particularly COVID and post COVID. So, climate change impacts mental health through direct trauma from disasters, increased anxiety and depression from stressors such as heat and displacement, and psychological responses to the growing climate crisis such as eco-anxiety, ecological grief, solastalgia. These effects include trauma, mood disorders, sleep disruption, and increased aggression. Air pollution has been linked to increased depression and anxiety, to sleep issues, and studies also show cognitive decline in older adults being accelerated by air pollution. There's also a positive correlation between regional suicide rates and glacial area, except in low latitude countries. Although melt rate variability showed no significant correlation with suicide statistics, Greenland was the only country to demonstrate a negative relation. Now, don't worry, I have used these just as examples. I'm not going to be talking about such facts. What I want you to think about is all the words that I just said and the intersection of how these two fields are spoken about. It's the dominant discourse, it's the dominant knowledge around these two fields and their intersection. It's expert led, it's technical, it's not easily accessible, and the viewpoint is a very top down scientific approach. And it is this top down element which obscures or hides the linkages. And of course, this intersection that means, because it's spoken of like this, it's going to see the same obscuring across research and policy, that of expert, that of jargon, that of individual, scientific, biomedical, and disproportionately global north led. Now, what do I mean? Using this discourse and the examples I just gave, the focus is on individual attributes, individual behaviors, lifestyle changes, both as causal factors and as required targets of change. Example, focus remains on the individual, banning plastic straws, treatment gap of talk therapy or psychiatry, saving electricity, counseling for students in an educational institution, using bucket showers, self help, psychopharmacology, reducing individual carbon footprints. There's a common thread here: individual. These measures talk either about mental health or climate change like it's universally impacting people in the same way. And this hides the structural injustices that are involved in both mental health and climate change. And of course, yes, you can use objective scientific measures, if there is such a thing as objective scientific measures, but this really detracts from the systemic and structural factors that influence, inform, and distribute either climate change or mental health. For example, it's this expert individual lens that we can use and critique to shine a light on the idea of adaptation or of resilience, because it puts the onus on the individual to change behaviors or to find recourse. And it's only on those who are affected. For everyone else, it's business as usual. Let's take an example. The term eco-anxiety, I mentioned it just now. It's really widely quoted in literature in the West, and it has been picked up by Indian mainstream mental health. Many papers have published, many abstracts have written about climate anxiety, eco-anxiety. Guess how many of them actually covered people who already live with clinical anxiety? A big fat zero. What does this tell you? It tells you that, well, not only climate anxiety is being medicalized and pathologized, but it also tells you that mental illness serves as a prop for the climate change folks or the climate change scientists who say that XYZ causes X impairment, and so something needs to be done about it. So, what's the idea? You prevent disability in XYZ individuals, but you don't look at what transformative system changes are needed, especially for persons with disabilities. So, most research, in fact, a lot of mental health and climate research focuses on how climate can cause disability, quantifying it in terms like disability adjusted life year. It doesn't consider how persons with disability are actually affected, whether it's persons with severe mental illness or those who use wheelchairs. And so, what is obscured? It's very specific vulnerabilities and marginalizations of those with psychosocial disability, right? And we know from research in high income countries, because it has been done for persons with disability to a limited extent, but but privileged persons. So we know from high income countries that climate disasters do exacerbate pre-existing mental health conditions. Individuals with psychosocial disability do face 3 to 4 times higher mortality rate during heat waves, right? Medication for either epilepsy or schizophrenia, or any one of us who takes SSRIs, causes us to find it harder to thermoregulate. Same is true of substance dependency. Yet, what happens once you are disabled? Research and policy is more interested in preventing that rather than doing anything to serve you. The system actually ignores you. Climate crises are disabling. Yet, the people who know how best to live in and to navigate a world and an environment that is hostile to them are quite left out of the equation. And it's interesting, in light of all this expert jargon and talk, the more papers I read on climate change, I found out that all these papers say that the value of biodiversity and human health is a non-market impact. Yet, most figures will say something like poor mental health is estimated to cost reduced productivity, which is projected to be some 6 trillion by 2030. So you can see what these systems are valuing. And the reason I'm pointing to this intersection is because what we see now as climate change or the crisis of mental health, these are systems failures. In particular, neoliberal extractive systems that are called development or progress. And I'm calling them systemic failures because the idea is not to focus on, the experts have it wrong, global north has it wrong. But the idea is to say that these are fundamental flaws in the very design of the system, because not only do they reinforce the status quo, they do not allow us to center those who are the most affected. And moreover, once you are affected, you fall short in approach, care, and support, right? There's unfortunately, just to make things harder on everyone, there's a third field that reinforces these systems failures in climate change and in mental health, and that's philanthropy, my field. It's also marked by and reflects the same systems failure. The whole Western copy paste, the philanthrocapitalism, the reliance on the expert, the top down, the tertiary health center, and of course, let's not forget tech solutionism. Okay, it obstructs all structural injustice. And just again, to give you an example, it's not just futures of disability, but queer trans communities face homelessness due to discriminatory housing, documentation failures, familial abandonment. You're likely forced to relocate to an area that is geographically vulnerable. And then what happens once disaster hits? You're not counted in relief, you're not counted in death sometimes. You may experience gender-based violence, but guess what? Philanthropy thinks that gender is only binary. LGBTQ is an LGBTQ silo. They just need funding for LGBTQ things. LGBTQ people need to be represented in education. Oh my God. It just doesn't happen, right? So that's what I mean to say. It is a systems failure. And apart from reinforcing these status quo dynamics, unfortunately, philanthropy, for those of us who work on mental health in the room, has taken a decidedly biomedical approach to funding mental health, right? Same individual providing cure or symptom or solution. And this is why today I wanted to raise the idea that disability justice and a social justice lens must be central if we are to address mental health and climate change. There needs to be a radical re envisioning of mental health care in policy and services for climate induced distress. And these conversations need to surpass the search for biological causal links behind distress. And mental health advocacy needs to rally for more than just therapeutic access and clinician rooms. In both community care and in clinical intervention, not only does it need to be equipped with a rights based lens, it needs to be equipped with a way to respond to structures of oppression. People have spoken about social determinants, sure, but it needs to respond to structural determinants. And it is important to navigate climate distress through affirmative lenses informed by an understanding of caste inequality, class inequality, historical uprooting, generational loss, colonial history. And by colonial history, I don't mean British and Indian, I mean Savarna, dominant caste, and indigenous, and gendered and ableist ability to recourse. And that's easily said, but I want to end by saying that the two movements need to speak to each other, not the fields. I'm not saying the fields, I'm saying the movements, not the experts. They need to speak to each other about arriving at transformative, rights based, disability inclusive climate justice. And the term is climate justice. So that we can keep the focus on political, ethical, and the justice dimensions of mental health and climate change. So I'll say that I want to end on a note of collective action and solidarity. Instead of perpetuating extractive dynamics, which all these fields do, our practices must be connected to community struggles and feed into processes that contest power. And it's such collective climate action that may have at least some capacity to help. And these are the activities that can foster a sense of hope, community connection, and social support. Because if we are to imagine futures of psychosocial thriving, of rights, of liberation, of justice, we must break out of the siloed approach and zero sum game thinking, because social justice is structurally connected to the environment, water, wildlife, mental health, and of course, overall human health.